all eyes are on Vikavolt being our main new ingredient farmer for coffee. Welcome back to another Pokemon Sleep video. It's Bro Vinny here. Today we're talking about the 3 new Pokemon, and now that we finally have the ingredient rate of all 3 Pokemon, we can compare and see which one does the best at what. I will be doing a deep dive into all 3, but if you're here just for a quick conclusion, it is what most people expected. You need a Grubbin or Vikavolt for mono coffee. That is priority for everyone, unless you're thinking of using an Aggron for a temporary coffee farming, while you hunt the perfect Grubbin. Alternatively, Aggron can be used as a sausage farmer, replacing any poor investments on Charizard previously, or if you decided to go with the Ginger Charizard, there is now relief for sausages. And although Aggron is better than Charizard as sausages, it's only about 1 to 2%, so not very much. So anyone who uses a mono sausage Charizard shouldn't swap to an Aggron because the difference is just too small. As for Luxray, well, that's an awkward one. There's nothing really that stands out for Luxray, for tomato, for oil, for berry. It has coffee, but it's level 60 only. It's a very awkward addition to the game. Yet, Shinx is one of the fan favorites because it's just adorable. Now, I did do a YouTube poll a few days ago, and it's gathered over 1,000 votes, and you're all pretty much on point about which one is the most important. It is Vikavolt for getting coffee. Now, at the time, we didn't have a confirmed ingredient rate, and if Aggron had a good speed and good ingredient rate, maybe it could do coffee as well as a semi-mono option. But that turned out to not be the case, and we're going to go into the deep dive in a moment. However, if you do happen to land a decent Aggron and you don't need it for sausages, it can be used to focus on farming coffee as a temporary option. Now, just to give you an overview of how coffee looks in this game, there are only 3 Pokemon that can do coffee, and they are the 3 new releases. I'm largely comparing everything with no natures or sub-skills and keeping everyone at max energy. And we're not valuing main skill just to keep the comparison fair, because it's really hard to compare expand pot Pokemon to self-healing Pokemon since they do different things. But by and large, ingredient specialists should farm exactly the ingredients that you need and then swap out and let other Pokemon take its spot. So main skill to me is not too important, as long as they do their job properly. And just a reminder why that is the case is because ingredients suffer a bag space limit and a pot size limit. At the moment you reach those limits, there's very little value in running ingredient specialists, unless for some reason it happens to be a dual specialist, which we discussed in a different video, and we'll briefly touch on that today as well. But none of these are good dual specialists, so we are mainly focused on just running the ingredients. And one more bit of information just to remind everyone before we start this deep dive analysis is that Charjabug requires a Thunderstone to evolve. So if we're looking at the costs of investment, we really do want a near perfect Grubbin before we invest it all the way, especially if you've already used the 2 free Thunderstones that the game has given you. Of course, there was a 3rd one as well from the Raikou event, but between Magnezone, Jolteon and Raichu, you may already have used up all the Thunderstones, and that is why you may need a temporary Aggron while you raise your dishes as you're hunting Grubbin if you don't get a perfect one to start with. But make no mistake, Aggron is nowhere near as good as Vikavolt in terms of coffee farming. It wouldn't make sense for you to settle on a mono coffee Vikavolt that doesn't have good stats in order to buy you time to hunt the perfect Aggron, because the difference in coffee farming is just too big. So how big is the difference? I've set the Raininix calculator to have mono coffee for Vikavolt, semi-mono coffee for Aggron, and then level 60 coffee for Luxray, and have everyone at level 60 and everyone at max energy. Now, the final ingredient rate for Vikavolt is at 19.4%, for Aggron is 28.5%, so heavily making up for its slow speed, and for Luxray at 20%. 28.5% is one of the highest ingredient rates you can get in this game, In fact, if it weren't for Slarking's weird ingredient rate at 34%, Aggron would be the king of ingredient rate. But remember, ingredient rate by itself doesn't tell you how much ingredients are farmed. You need to combine that with the speed in order to get the actual ingredient production. I'm just highlighting that Aggron's slow speed is made up for by ingredient rate. Now, if we're purely looking at coffee, one of the best ingredients current day, because the current 3 best dishes in each dish type all need coffee, then Vikavolt farms 70 coffees. By the way, these numbers don't mean anything because I haven't put any stats in. I am only using these numbers as a way to compare between different Pokemon. So 70 coffee with Vikavolt, 55 coffee only with Aggron, and 30 coffee if you're using a Luxray at level 60 for coffee. Funnily enough, even if the sausages were coffee and you added the 13.79 coffee to the 55, this number still wouldn't beat Vikavolt's 70 coffee. So even if sausages were useful to you, Aggron just isn't better than Vikavolt in both manner. Not to mention that coffee actually has a higher base strength than sausages as well. There's just no competition for Vikavolt's coffee farming. But if you happen to not get a good mono coffee Vikavolt, and for some reason you landed a semi-mono mushroom because Vikavolt's other ingredient that you can farm would be mushroom, and you happen to have a perfect Aggron that has semi-mono coffee, well, could this work? Does Vikavolt farming mushrooms actually make sense if you decide to run a perfect Aggron for coffee instead? Well, let's take a look. Our current best mushroom farmer is Quagsire. How does it compare to a mono mushroom Quagsire? It actually comes really close. We're talking about a 2% difference between Vikavolt and Quagsire while getting a little bit of coffee on the way. So it can actually be done if you happen to get a perfect mushroom farming Vikavolt and a perfect coffee farming Aggron. Then you might stop hunting both species and just settle for that. Of course, a perfect mono coffee Vikavolt would still be better, and you would run a perfect mono sausage Charizard or Aggron instead, and then a perfect mono mushroom Quagsire. But I also understand that this game is not cheap to play, so if you happen to get these stats instead, it actually works as long as you don't already have a perfect Quagsire. Otherwise, I don't understand why you would try to replace it with a Vikavolt when it's not actually better, especially if we're talking about level 30. These numbers are comparing level 60. At level 30, that difference pulls away really quickly. So you can see now that Quagsire farms about 40 mushrooms, whereas Vikavolt only farms about 30. Semi-mono options like ABB options like these will only really make sense for the long term when you do hit level 60. By the way, just a side note, Vikavolt does beat Gengar in mushroom farming just by a little bit. Next, what if you have coffee sorted by Aggron? Let's say you do have a level 60 Aggron. By the way, that's a tough feat to achieve because level 60 is quite costly and these are new Pokemon. That means we have almost no candies for them. What if you happen to find a berry finding Vikavolt? How does it compare to the true berry specialist that is Butterfree in terms of berry finding? Unfortunately, because of Vikavolt's slower speed, it already doesn't look good for it, and they have largely the same for ingredient rates, meaning that Butterfree beats Vikavolt more than 3:2 ratio, so 201 divided by 125 is more than 1.5, because it's just faster at finding berries. So I wouldn't recommend running Vikavolt for berry finding unless it just happens to be a bonus skill. If you happen to have berry finding and you have mono coffee and you have some speed, that makes sense. But it in no way replaces Butterfree, like in the case of Pokemon like Dragonite or Gengar or Meowscarada that we covered in another video. So in conclusion, for Vikavolt, the best way to use it is mono coffee. All 3 slots of ingredients must be coffee. Because Mushroom has options, Bugberry has options, it just needs to focus on coffee. Our next deep dive is Aggron, and we've already decided that it's not the best for coffee, although you can use it for coffee. But the other ingredient that can farm is sausages. How does it compare to our current king of sausage before its release, Charizard. Now, prior to Aggron, Charizard was the only ingredient specialist that can do sausages at base level, which was a problem for people who had actually invested in a Ginger Charizard like this, when Ginger had a much better option that was Tyranitar. So the good news is, no matter the outcome, people who invested in the Ginger Charizard will find that Aggron is a great addition to the game, because you can have Aggron doing mono sausages now, as opposed to hunting another Charizard to do sausages. But if you were to run a Ginger Charizard, does that put Tyranitar out of a job? Or is Tyranitar going to focus on farming beans, but then what will Golem do? So that's all a decision you have to make yourself based on what you've already invested in. Alright, let's go back to sausages because that's the main comparison here. Between Aggron and Charizard, Aggron actually beats Charizard, now taking the king of sausages title away from Charizard. The difference is very marginal. In fact, if we divide 96.51 to 94.85, we get a 1.75% difference, so a very small marginal difference. So for those of you who have been following the mono ingredient build with Charizard at the top, well, I wouldn't recommend changing for such a small difference, especially if your original mono Charizard was really good to begin with. To get good enough stats to actually beat your Charizard enough on an Aggron with mono sausage will be difficult. So if you've been following the mono ingredient build, I would just avoid Aggron altogether, unless of course you use it for coffee. And I think Aggron is a decent coffee support while you're hunting Vikavolt. The only problem is that's only true at level 60. So coming back to the 3 new Pokemon comparison, if we actually set the level to 30, well, the difference in coffee is much bigger. We're talking about a 70% more coffee by Vikavolt than we get from Aggron if they both focus coffee at level 30. Now, some may argue that because Aggron's charge energy is a self buff, if you weren't running a healer on the team, that makes the sausage farming even bigger of a difference with Charizard. But then Charizard also does ingredient magnet, and if the ingredient magnet happens to land on good ingredients that you need for this week, then the difference isn't as big anymore. Now, because these two skills do different things and they both have their own benefits, that is why I've largely left out main skill from the discussion. But you are right, if I were to run a no healing strategy, Charizard suffers from that so much that Aggron is much better at sausages than Charizard. Although I would say that you should generally run a healer anyway, and if you nap with optimal strategies, and we've covered this before in another video, you shouldn't be hitting really low energy levels. Next, let's see if Aggron actually has a chance at being a dual specialist, and as I said before, it doesn't. If we have a look at how much berry difference between Steelix and Aggron, by giving them both berry finding S, there is still a huge difference. We're talking about an 80% difference between the two species in terms of berry finding. And 80% more is bigger than the 3-to-2 ratio difference that you might expect. And this time, it's not because of a difference in speed, because actually, both of them have the same speed. The difference is because Steelix has a very low ingredient rate, which is amazing for a berry specialist, whereas Aggron has a very high ingredient rate, therefore reducing the berry count. But not only that, some might argue that, well, if you don't have a Steelix because it's just so expensive to find one, they're available in limited areas, so Onix and Steelix are both available at Taupe Hollow. By the way, Steelix is available at Old Gold Power Plant, but not Onix. So you could argue that because of how rare or impossible Steelix is to get, well, maybe you run a berry finding Aggron for steel berries. Well, that argument will have to be followed by that there are no other species that do berries better than Aggron. So let's take a look next. I'm in the Pokédex section of the Rainonex calculator, and I'm going to filter for only steel Pokemon and look at their berry count and rank them in order. As we already know, Steelix at 184 berries is at the top of the berry game. But before we get down to Aggron, there's one more species that can do berries better than Aggron, and that is actually Magnezone. The argument for using an Aggron for berries fails because, well, Magnemite isn't too hard to farm now that Old Gold Power Plant is here, because you can just hunt a berry finding Magnemite if you don't want to ever hunt a Steelix. Although the difference is still huge between the two species, and we are looking at a 60% improvement if you have a Steelix for steel berries. Magnezone is still better berries than Aggron. But there is a second problem. This analysis is assuming that only steel berries are useful. If we now focus on the berry typing for all gold power plant only, so selecting electric, ghost, and steel berries, all three types, now we don't want to rank them on berry count because electric berries are significantly weaker than steel berries. What we want to do is rank them by berry strength. I will display both berry strength and berry count just to illustrate the difference, but berry strength will multiply the actual berries base strength at that level to the berry count, in which case the strongest berry farmer for all gold power plant is Steelix. But have a look at where Aggron is. We have to go through Raichu, Banette, which were expected, they are the best berry specialists of their types, and go through Halloween Pikachu, which may not be as intuitive because even though it is a berry specialist, it's nowhere near as fast as Raichu, and go through Pikachu, Gengar, Jolteon, Raikou, Magnezone, which was what we were saying about it being second best at berry farming, and then go through Ampharos, even Christmas Pikachu, and Shuppet, and then Luxray and Dedenne before we get down to Aggron. There is no reason at all to be running berry finding Aggron. In fact, it might even harm your sausage or coffee production because it's going to fill up the inventory. So this difference of 30,000 strength to the species up here who produce 40 to 50,000 strength is just too big. So if you had to decide, I'd probably avoid berry finding for Aggron and just focus on its ingredient productions. If it simply happens to have berry finding, that's not a bad thing as long as you collect often that the inventory limit isn't reached. But I must admit that I was surprised when I did this analysis that even Christmas Pikachu that almost nobody uses beats Aggron in terms of berry strength. Finally, the third deep dive for today, and probably the most tricky one of all, is Luxray. Now Luxray can do mono tomato farming, but tomato options in this game is probably the most abundant. We've got Victory Bell, we've got Abomasnow, we've got Mr. Mime, we've got Dugtrio. In fact, let's put them all up and see how they compare to each other. I've even put in the semi-mono option with Venusaur focusing on tomatoes. So if all species are to focus on their tomato farming, Luxray farms 84.7 tomatoes, beating out Venusaur semi-mono option, beating out Dugtrio. It does actually beat Victory Bell, definitely beats Mr. Mime, and very, very marginally beating out Abomasnow, making Luxray the king of tomatoes. But if you had already invested in a tomato option prior to this, because there's so many options, it doesn't make sense to switch to a Luxray for the tiny difference. Now, just a note that the previous mono ingredient build based on this says that Victory Bell is the best at farming tomato, only because we needed to reserve Abomasnow for eggs because Delibird was almost impossible to find. But in truth, based on max energy levels, Abomasnow is extremely slightly better than Victory Bell at tomatoes. It's just not the choice to make. Because of the limited egg options in this game, you should actually get an Abomasnow for temporary egg farming while hunting Delibird, or just wait for the next egg species to be released. So I didn't even want to put Abomasnow into this discussion because it just needs to focus on eggs until better egg farmers come along. But if you happen to have a mono tomato Abomasnow and you've got a good Delibird with eggs, then it is very good to use it for tomato farming. With Luxray, I would say pretty much on par with Abomasnow. I would not call a 0.03% difference a big enough difference to hunt and use Luxray for tomato farming if you already have a Victory Bell or an Abomasnow for it.
Although, if you actually have a Mr. Mime that does mono tomatoes or a Duck Trio that does mono tomatoes, it is a significant improvement to use now a Luxray for tomatoes. If you happen to get one, I think it's a good investment then. How about oil? The other ingredient that Luxray can farm is oil. Now, to be honest, I think there's an inherent bias against poison types in many Pokemon games. And generally speaking, I feel like people try to avoid Toxicroak because I'm not sure, maybe it's ugly. Even Piggy says Toxicroak is a bit creepy. And look, that's fine. So let's see if we can find a better option for oil farming, because currently Toxicroak is the best at farming oil. The other two potential oil species before Luxray were Ditto, which by the way should focus on farming tails, but I'll put it here just for comparison, and Cramorant. And what I sometimes hear people do is run a level 60 oil Dragonite. Now this one's quite niche. First of all, you gotta reach level 60 for this to even be a consideration for oil, but because Dragonite as an ingredient specialist is so strong, it can actually do a reasonable amount of oil. The problem with this build, with an AAC build, herb oil, is that the moment you go from level 59 to level 60 unlocking oil, you're actually reducing your herb productions. So just to clarify that point, this is a level 59 Dragonite which was farming you 77 herbs before you make it level 60. The moment you go to level 60, it now farms you 52 herbs. You've reduced the amount of herbs, which is what Dragonite excels at, to farm, well, a lot of oil. And look, with the perfect stats, look, it can be possible that this is a good mixed option for both ingredients. But that is to say that you'll leave out these other species from oil farming if you're going to do that. When there's not a lot of good herb options around, I personally think I'd rather have the level 60 option as herbs instead, and it farming 100 herbs as opposed to 50 herbs, and then just swap out for my oil farmer when I need oil, instead of over farming either oil or herb when I don't need the other ingredient. So anyway, I've decided to leave oil here just for those people who run an oil Dragonite for comparison. Let's start with our original oil species, all at level 60. We are focusing only on oil productions. Toxicroak always has been the best oil farmer. Again, just ignoring skills for a moment, because I know people do like the Tasty Chance skill, but Tasty Chance isn't as easy to use as you might think. Just because a lot of people use it doesn't mean you should too. If you're using Tasty Chance, I recommend that you cook strong dishes, high recipe bonus, high ingredient strength, high base strength for extra ingredients, and at high dish levels. If you aren't doing those optimally, the value of Tasty Chance reduces. And plus, would you really give 5 main seeds for a Pokemon that cannot evolve, that isn't a skill specialist, when there's a better skill specialist around for that? And that's Dedenne. So again, we're going to leave out Tasty Chance or any skills from this discussion, and Toxicroak farms the most oil of all the species. But now with Luxray on the scene, it can do oil as a semi-mono option, since you probably don't need it for tomatoes. Well, thankfully, Luxray at 66.5 oil does come really close to Toxicroak's 68.4. Again, this is only at level 60. If we go back down to level 30, you need to use a Toxicroak for oil. But at level 60, it makes some sense to be using Luxray for oil, because it's easier to hunt a species that is a BB, which is a 2 in 9 chance of getting this ingredient list, than it is to get a species that is a option, which is a 1 in 9 chance to hunt. In addition to that, Luxray has a much higher base inventory than Toxicroak. Well, partly because it can evolve twice, whereas Toxicroak can only evolve once. So if you've been having trouble hunting Toxicroak, or you've just not liked hunting Toxicroak altogether, then Luxray makes a lot of sense. You should look for a semi-mono option, which is a BB Shinx for future oil farming. Until you get to level 60 though, you actually do still need Toxicroak to do your oil farming. Side note is Ditto can do AAC farming for oil at level 30. I don't mind Cramorant, but it's more expensive to catch than a Shinx. So if you haven't already got a mono oil Cramorant or a mono oil Toxicroak, then it does make sense to look for a semi-mono Shinx. But the king of oils still belongs to Toxicroak. Okay, so what if you already have a perfect Toxicroak and a perfect Victory Bell for farming tomatoes and oils? Do you still have any use for Luxray? Let's take a look at berry productions. We've actually touched on this just now. That's because it's an electric type. It is a power plant berry producer. Remember this list here that I showed you? Aggron was all the way down here. Well, actually, Luxray isn't much better. Even Luxray loses to Christmas Cat Pikachu. And that's quite concerning since, by the way, Christmas Cat Pikachu is a skill specialist. And it also loses to a Shuppet if they both have berry finding. When there's this many options to go for berry options, I don't think you should focus on having a Luxray for berry finding. But just to complete the assessment, I'm going to now remove all other species except electric types to compare how Luxray looks in terms of berry finding if you only care about electric types. For example, if you were to land Electric Berry at Greengrass. Once again, Raichu is at the top, followed by Halloween Pikachu. And the closest dual specialist that is a berry finding non-berry specialist would be Jolteon and Raikou. Luxray just isn't in the picture because it's significantly slower in its speed than any of these species. So that was the deep dive on the 3 new ingredient specialists. Once again, the conclusion is go for a mono coffee Vikavolt if you can. It may work if you hit level 60 for Aggron to be focused on coffee, in which case you may run a Vikavolt that does mushrooms instead, although not my recommendation. This kind of build is a bit more niche given that mushrooms have better farmers including Quagsire, and even Gengar is an option for mushroom when there's not a lot of coffee options. But one interesting thing to note about the introduction of Luxray is that previously I suggested to go for an AAA Toxicroak, which is purely oil, because there's not a lot of options besides Toxicroak. But for whatever reason, if you were to have found a nearly perfect stats, but the wrong ingredient list like AAB Toxicroak, it's actually okay to run it at level 30. While you wait for a perfect Shinx that does oil, so like an ABB Luxray. So if you're not a big fan of Toxicroak anyway, just run it at level 30 until you find a Shinx good enough to raise to level 60. But until you get the Luxray to level 60, you will continue to use Toxicroak for oil. Definitely isn't worth hunting a Luxray for coffee when it's only available at level 60. It will farm you a lot less coffee than the other 2 options. Put Luxray into either doing tomatoes or oils depending on your needs. And lastly, and probably the least important, is to look at the main skills of the 3 Pokemon and how they compare to their peers. Now once again, unless for some reason these skill rates are exceptionally high for their specialty, there wouldn't be much reason to be dumping main skill seeds on ingredient Pokemon when they should be swapping out fairly early if they're actually doing their job. Alright, regardless, let's take a look at Vikavolt first. So Vikavolt can evolve twice. That means level 3 main skill is for free. It has a 5.18 chance to trigger at every production, giving you a total of about 4 triggers per 24 hours. So I've got my settings set to 24 hours. So we're going to filter for only Charge Strength S Pokemon, but it's a little tricky because remember, and I've done this video before, there are 2 charge strength skills. One is a variable outcome and one is a fixed outcome. The variable outcome is the one that gives you more strength. But let's look at the fixed outcome charge strength S first, because that's what Vikavolt does. It does a fixed outcome of charge strength. It is actually at the top of the game. So at first you might think that, well, actually Vikavolt is the best charge strength S skill user of all of these Pokemon. So why wouldn't you put some main skill seeds in? Well, first of all, because it's an ingredient specialist, you really want to have it do a lot of ingredients and then swap out because of pot and recipe and ingredient bag limits. So once it's done enough coffee, you should be swapping out to, let's say, a Raichu instead. So the time Vikavolt spends on the field is going to be less than Raichu. So Raichu makes more sense to have your main skill seeds instead, despite the higher rate of Vikavolt. Because there's no limit of how long you can use Raichu for, especially if you're at power plant. You should be using a berry finding Raichu pretty much 24/7 as a staple farmer the entire week, and as a result actually getting more return from your main skill seeds because Raichu spends longer on the field than Vikavolt. If you don't understand that point, let me know in the comment section below. But there is a second problem, and the second problem is that if we include the better of the charge strength, which is the variable outcome charge strength, well, Raichu is much lower down the list. And while Vikavolt does come third, there are two better options for your main skill seeds. One is Golduck, which is double the skill trigger amount at 8 triggers per 24 hours if you don't sleep, 4 triggers for Vikavolt. But even in between those two species, Feraligatr, among non-skill specialists, is still at the top. So Feraligatr, for the same reason I gave about Raichu, deserve your main skill seeds even more than Raichu does if we were to ignore the berry typing, because it triggers more and also has an indefinite use on the team being a berry specialist. So particularly for free-to-play players, I would not recommend seeding an ingredient specialist that uses charge strength, because you won't see as much value than if you were to use it on a berry specialist. Next, let's take a look at Aggron. It's a self-healing main skill, charge energy. How does it compare to its peers of the same skill? Now remember that charge energy, by and large, is a fairly useless skill if you're always above 80% for whatever reason. And if you happen to feel like you're not actually getting enough energy, you can easily compensate a lack of skill trigger with one extra skill level. So for example, by giving the Pokemon a main skill seed to compensate for the lack of energy. So unlike other main skills, charge energy's value tends to taper off pretty quickly once you get to a certain trigger or certain skill level, because any further gains in energy doesn't help you farm any faster. Between 80 to 150% energy, you farm at the same rate anyway. Which is why Umbreon is one of the worst Pokemon in this game, because it's a skill specialist focused on charging its own energy, so much so that you almost never fall below 80%. But what's the point of charging energy if you're not farming ingredient or berries? Because it's a skill specialist, it excels at neither berries or ingredients. It's just charging its energy for not much use. Aggron is 4th position out of all the charge energy Pokemon, falling behind Skeledirge and Tyranitar. And because it's a 3-stage evolution Pokemon, I feel like a level 3 charge energy is a fairly good amount at those trigger rates. And as long as all Pokemon remain above 80% throughout the day, this ranking and the differences in the numbers don't actually make any difference. It's not like 5 triggers is better than 3.8 if they're all above 80%. And if you don't understand that part, again, ask me in the comments section below. But here is the interesting thing about charge energy. You should actually put main skill seeds on the ones that aren't very good at healing themselves. So for example, Quagsire doesn't have a very good trigger rate compared to the other species. In fact, it's half of Skeledirge, and it's only 1 evolution. So you actually have a better chance of Quagsire falling below 80% than Aggron or Skeledirge. Which means to optimize your productions, you should actually be seeding the charge energy Pokemon that aren't charging enough. Of course, if you do run an energy for everyone healer, then that shouldn't be a problem for all of these species. But if you do find that Quagsire or Raticate, they're just not healing themselves enough, you will see more value in putting your main skill seeds on these species than these species, since they're already capping out to max productions throughout the day. This is in contrast to charge strength, which gets better the more seeds you put into the Pokemon. So for charge strength, like Vikavolt, You can see that between level 1 to 2, you're only getting about 169 strength difference without area bonus, but at level 6 to 7, you get about 1,000 more strength. So the more main skill seeds you put into the Pokemon, the better it gets. And it's exponential, which is not the case for Charge Energy. And finally, let's look at Luxray's cooking power up. How does it compare to its peers? So I filtered for cooking power up Pokemon, and as you can see here, well, we already know that Magnezone is the best at cooking power-up skill, but it's not a lot better than Glaceon and Flareon. It's only a slight improvement compared to Glaceon and Flareon. So if you use any of the 3 for Expand Pot, you're not going to see a huge difference. What is interesting is that if we look at these non-skill specialist species, Luxray is at the top. Well, there's only 2 to start with. There's Meowscarada and Luxray. So if you do decide to use cooking power-up skill on an ingredient specialist, Luxray is better than Meowscarada by about 10%. But the same argument as before is that if you're done farming tomatoes or oil, you should be swapping out Luxray for something else, maybe a Magnezone or maybe a berry specialist. I don't personally feel that it's worth putting your main skill seeds into Luxray than it is to put it into Magnezone. But it is nice to see that Luxray is more than half of the skill triggers as Magnezone, because what we tend to say is that skill specialists, generally speaking, have double the skill rates as other specialties. So if a non-skill specialist has above half the amount of skill triggers, like in the case of Luxray, 2.48 times 2 is bigger than 4.58, what we are seeing more like a dual specialist in this case. The dual specialty is ingredient and skill, but just be very careful about using that as an argument, because Magnezone, being a true skill specialist, can get double banking, and double banking is crucially important because it's not about the double triggers, it's about the fact that it will continue to count down to your next skill if you haven't collected the first one. So you are still expected to get more triggers using a skill specialist for Expand Pot than you are to see it on Luxray. Even if we give 2 times the trigger rate to Luxray, it doesn't benefit from double banking of main skills. So how has that changed our mono ingredient build? Thank you to Banana Tanks for always helping us out with making the mono ingredient graphic. Now it's starting to look a bit more complicated, but that's a good thing because we are getting more redundancies on which Pokemon can do what. Now this graphic is still being finalized, and you'll find the final version on my Discord sometime after this video, but I'm going to give you guys a sneak peek first. There are some changes to this graphic. You can now see some colors on the side of these ingredient specialists. What these mean is they're currently used in the best curry salad or dessert dishes. So we mentioned in my last video that some ingredients are just not being used in the 3 top dishes, and they include eggs, cacao, corn, and if you were only cooking the top 3 coffee dishes, you're not going to be running these Pokemon at all by following these graphics. That doesn't mean you shouldn't use them, because you could use them for cooking other dishes. It's just to highlight which Pokemon are in the top of the meta, and they would be Quagsire for mushrooms, Luxray for tomatoes, or if you want to use Victory Bell, that's fine as well. And I would actually recommend just going for Victory Bell because Luxray is a much later addition in the game. It's available in the last island. Besides the event at Greengrass, you can't get a Luxray anyway, so I would say just go for a mono tomato Victory Bell. Use a Beans Golem, Ginger Tyranitar. You can see that Vikavolt is used in all 3 dish types for its coffee, Potato with Meowscarada, Oil with Toxicroak, Aggron is now the king of sausages, and Skeledirge for apples. You will also need a Quaquaval for leeks, but be careful about this is that, first of all, there's a little exclamation mark, is that it is not a true mono species, it's just the only possible species at the top of its game. But at level 30, Ductrio is still better at farming leeks. So you should actually start with a Ductrio until you can get a Quaquaval to level 60. Use Tails as your extra ingredients. Once again, that's an exclamation mark there because it's not a true mono species. There's just no mono species for Tails. And the other 2 points I want to illustrate from this graphic, Oil can be an alternative for Luxray if you don't want to use Toxicroak for oil, and Aggron is an alternative for coffee farming if you've already got a Charizard for sausages. Once again, because Charizard is an earlier game option and the improvement with Aggron isn't huge, I would say just stick to a Charizard for mono sausage. And one new addition to this graphic is a little red icon here, which signifies even though it is mono, there is a large performance drop, so it farms a lot less ingredient than its competitor. For example, Gengar, we've always said, is a mono herb farmer, but it's just nowhere near as good as Dragonite. Corn farming is just not very good with Comfey, even though it is an earlier game option if you haven't unlocked Lakeside. But otherwise, Beware is your main corn farmer. Kangaskhan is a weird one. It's not only significantly worse than the Tyranitar Ginger, it's also more expensive to catch and doesn't have evolutions. A highly not recommended species to catch. I do recommend you guys spend some time studying this graphic, because if you understand this graphic, it just means you understand ingredient specialists altogether. I won't look at every single ingredient because there's just too much to go through, but largely everything else has remained the same. And one more addition to our infographics on our Discord is we now have the Old Gold Power Plant catchable species separated by their sleep types, dozing, snoozing, and slumbering graphic. Credits to Daifuku Matcha for making these graphics that I translate into English for you guys. You can also find this graphic under Quick Guides in my Discord. We haven't really talked about this yet, but Old Gold Power Plant has a lot of meta species. So of course we've got the 3 new Pokemon, Aron, Shinx, and Grubbin, but guess who is also here? Sprigatito, Fuecoco, and Quaxly, the 3 Paldean Pokemon that got released just recently, as well as Wooper, the king of mushroom farming, and Steelix, the king of steelberries, Magnemite, who is the best at its skill, and finally a good way to farm Mareep and Magnemite candies, as well as Dedenne, the king of Tasty Chance S, and we do have 1 legendary Raikou in this area as well. So besides the new Pokemon, there's actually a lot of benefit for staying at Old Gold Power Plant for farming. The only other thing I would have wanted to see at Power Plant is Onyx. Then I personally wouldn't have too many reasons to go back to Taupe Hollow at all. At Old Gold Power Plant, I am stuck to hunting Steelix as opposed to Onyx, which is a more expensive catch. Thank you for watching, guys. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments section below, and good luck with your Grubbin hunting. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and consider becoming a member of my YouTube to financially support me in making video contents like this.